Chapter 1, The Critical Mass, 1976 Explosion. Welcome to Synapse Daily. Forget the humble beginnings of 1965. Forget the first walls of 1971. By 1976, Arcosanti had stopped being a quiet architectural experiment. It had become a fever. A critical mass. The high Arizona desert was no longer silent. If you stood on the mesa in the summer of '76, you didn't hear the wind, you heard the roar of 1,000 voices. 1,000 volunteers. It was the highest concentration of human energy the project would ever see. They weren't just here to learn, they were here to occupy. 1976 was the year the world decided Arcosanti was the alternative America. People arrived from every continent, carrying nothing but a sleeping bag and a desperate hope that the old world was finally over. The site was bursting at the seams. This wasn't a construction project anymore, it was a city-state in the making. The air was thick with the scent of cheap tobacco, sunblock, and the metallic tang of massive concrete pours. The question wasn't will it work anymore. The question was, how do we survive each other? Chapter 2, The Bicentennial Mirage, The Other America. While the rest of the United States was draped in red, white, and blue for the 1976 bicentennial, Arcosanti was draped in dust and sweat. While millions watched parades in New York and D.C., 1,000 rebels were staring at a basalt canyon. 1976 was a year of profound irony. The American dream was celebrating its 200th birthday, but in the desert, these volunteers were conducting an autopsy on that very dream. The energy crisis had turned the suburban lifestyle into a nightmare of gas lines. In 1976, Arcosanti wasn't just a site, it was a political statement. The volunteers weren't celebrating the past, they were trying to build a future that didn't require oil or highways. This was the Bicentennial Mirage. To the media, it looked like a moon base. To the volunteers, it was the only sane place left on Earth. The 1976 peak was the moment Arcosanti became the global headquarters for the lean alternative. It was a year of radical contrast, the high-tech hope of the future clashing with the primal heat of the desert. Chapter 3, The Logistical Siege, Feeding the Thousand. Let's talk about the reality of a 1,000-person surge. In 1971, you could know everyone's name. In 1976, you were lucky if you knew where your next meal was coming from. The site was under a logistical siege. How do you provide water for 1,000 people on a dry mesa? How do you manage the waste? How do you prevent the camp from descending into chaos? The 1976 workshop peak pushed every system to the breaking point. The canteen became a 24-hour operation, churning out massive pots of brown rice and desert-grown vegetables. The makeshift plumbing was a map of desperation. People were living in the vaults, in tents on the cliff's edge, and in the crowded cubes of the East Crescent. This was the social arcology in its rawest form. There was no privacy. There was no escape from the heat or the noise. But in that friction, something strange happened. The shared struggle created a bond that was stronger than any concrete. The chaos of '76 was the fire that forged the community's soul. It was a beautiful, crowded, dirty miracle. Chapter 4, The Siltcast Symphony, Industrialized Labor. In the early years, silt casting was a delicate art, a few students carving patterns into the dirt. But by the 1976 peak, it had become a massive, human-powered industry. We aren't talking about small rooms anymore, we are talking about the ceramics apps and the foundry reaching their final, towering forms. Imagine an assembly line of 1,000 hands. In 1976, the concrete pours were events that lasted through the night. Under the glow of floodlights, hundreds of people formed human chains, passing buckets of wet cement like a bucket brigade in a fire. The scale was unprecedented. Soleri didn't have to inspire them with words anymore, the sheer momentum of 1,000 people working in unison was enough. This was the year the siltcast technique was perfected at a monumental scale. They weren't just building a dome, they were building an urban organ. The patterns carved into the silt in '76 were more complex, more ambitious. They were the signatures of 1,000 individuals etched forever into the ceilings of the city. Every time you look at the textures of Arcosanti today, you are looking at the frozen energy of that 1976 surge, the year the desert was conquered not by machines, but by the sheer collective will of 1,000 dreamers. Chapter 5, The Social Pressure Cooker, Propinquity in Action. In the previous chapters of the Arcosanti story, we talked about the theory. But in 1976, theory became a physical weight. Soleri's concept of propinquity, the idea that intense human closeness triggers evolution, was no longer a footnote in a book. It was 1,000 people breathing, eating, and dreaming in a space designed for a fraction of that number. Imagine the psychological tension. In 1976, there was no away. You worked on the siltcasts with the same people you shared a communal bowl of rice with. The traditional American buffer, the private car, the backyard fence, the suburban lawn, was gone. This was a radical experiment in human transparency. When you are one of 1,000 in the desert, your ego has nowhere to hide. Every disagreement over a concrete pour or a kitchen shift became a public debate. But this wasn't chaos, it was a social arcology. The 1976 peak proved that humans could adapt to density if they shared a transcendent goal. The friction of 1,000 bodies created a unique cultural heat. New forms of music, impromptu desert theater, and radical philosophical salons emerged every night under the stars. They were testing the limits of the human spirit. How much of myself do I have to give up to become part of US? 1976 provided the answer. In the heat of the desert, the individual melts, and the community is forged. Chapter 6, The Great Pour, 24 Hours of Concrete Fever. If 1971 was about the first walls, 1976 was about the massive, towering spans of the ceramics apse and the foundry. This was the architectural climax of the 1,000-volunteer surge. To finish these structures, the project moved into a phase of industrialized siltcasting. The Great Pours of 1976 are legendary among Arcosanti alumni. Imagine a 24-hour cycle of non-stop labor. The desert night was split open by massive floodlights. The air was thick with the gray dust of dry cement. Because they lacked heavy machinery, the 1,000 volunteers became the machine. They formed human chains reaching from the mixing stations at the bottom of the canyon all the way up to the top of the silt mounds. Bucket by bucket, ton by ton, the concrete moved. It was a rhythmic, primal dance. You could feel the mesa vibrating under the weight of the activity. There was a specific 1976 energy, a sense that if the chain broke, the dream would collapse. When the sun rose over the Agua Fria River, it revealed a newly cast vault, still steaming and wet, a massive gray rib rising against the red rock. It wasn't just construction, it was a collective ritual of creation. They weren't just pouring buildings, they were pouring their own lives into the stone. Chapter 7, The Media Circus, Arcosanti Under the Microscope. By the summer of 1976, the Mirage had become too big to ignore. The international media descended on the mesa like hawks. Newsweek, the New York Times, and film crews from the BBC arrived to document the 1,000 rebels. But they didn't find the hippie commune they expected. Instead, they found a disciplined, hyper-focused workforce of students and engineers. The 1976 peak turned Arcosanti into a global stage. The volunteers became the actors in a drama about the survival of the species. Reporters would ask, "Why are you here in the dirt when you could be in a comfortable office?" The answers they got were consistent, because the office is a dead end, and this is a beginning. This media attention brought a double-edged sword. It provided the fame that fueled bell sales and donations, but it also put immense pressure on the 1,000. Every failure, every cracked concrete slab, was now under a microscope. Arcosanti wasn't just a lab anymore, it was a prophecy being live-tested. In 1976, the world was looking for an alternative to the failing industrial grid, and they looked at Arcosanti with a mixture of hope and skepticism. The year of the 1,000 was the moment the project stopped being an architectural niche and became a global symbol of resistance against the sprawl. Chapter 8, The Foundry's Roar, Financing the Revolution. While the volunteers were the heart, the foundry was the lungs of the 1976 peak. By this year, the production of the Arcosanti bronze bells had reached its all-time high. To support 1,000 people, The project needed more than just idealism, it needed a hard currency engine. The foundry became a 24-hour furnace. Imagine the heat. Outside, the Arizona sun is 110 degrees. Inside the foundry, the molten bronze is glowing at 2,200 degrees. The volunteers working the foundry in '76 were like blacksmiths of the future. They used the same silt casting technology to create the bells that would eventually be sold in galleries from Paris to Tokyo. The sound of the bells became the constant soundtrack of 1976. The rhythmic clinking of the metalwork and the roar of the furnaces provided a sense of industrial purpose. This wasn't just art, it was the economic blood that allowed the concrete mixers to keep turning. Every bell cast in the summer of '76 carried a piece of the desert silt and the sweat of the thousand. It was a perfect, closed-loop economy. The earth provided the mold, the volunteers provided the fire, and the wind provided the music that kept the revolution funded. Chapter 9: The Energy Crisis and the Solar Prototype. We cannot talk about 1976 without talking about the darkness outside the desert. The 1970s energy crisis was peaking. Oil prices were skyrocketing, and the American way of life was shivering in the cold. In 1976, Arcosanti wasn't just a cool building, it was a survival manual. The 1,000 volunteers were living in a prototype of a post-oil world. While the rest of the country was debating nuclear power and coal, the residents of Arcosanti were perfecting passive solar architecture on a massive scale. The apses built in '76 were designed to capture the sun's path with mathematical precision. The volunteers didn't just build these solar collectors, they lived in them. They felt the concrete floors holding the heat through the cold desert nights. They experienced the deep shadows that kept the 110-degree heat at bay. 1976 was the year Arcosanti proved that we didn't need to fight nature to stay comfortable, we just needed to understand its geometry. It was a lesson in humility. The energy crisis didn't exist in Arcosanti, because they had already moved beyond the grid. They were showing the world that lean wasn't about poverty, it was about the intelligence of design. Chapter 10: The Autumn Exodus, the Bittersweet Silence. As the calendar turned toward the end of 1976, the fever of the thousand began to break. It was a slow, haunting transition. The frantic energy of the summer, the human chains, the midnight concrete pours, the 24-hour kitchen, began to ebb away. The seasonal volunteers, the workshoppers who had arrived with fresh eyes and idealistic hearts, started to pack their gear. The mesa, which had been a buzzing hive of 1,000 souls, slowly returned to a smaller, hardened core of permanent residents. But the silence that followed was different than the silence of 1965 or 1971. It was a silence filled with history. The dust settled on finished vaults that hadn't existed 6 months prior. This exodus was bittersweet. Many left because the desert had broken them, the heat, the lack of privacy, and the sheer physical exhaustion were too much for a lifetime. But they didn't leave empty-handed. They left with a new mental blueprint. The autumn of '76 was the moment Arcosanti transformed from a physical location into a portable idea. The 1,000 were gone, but the mesa was now a monument to what happens when human will reaches its boiling point. The desert was quiet again, but the concrete was now a permanent part of the horizon, cooling in the autumn air, waiting for the next generation of dreamers. Chapter 11: The Diaspora, the Seeds of a Green Century. What happened to the 1,000? This is the most important part of the 1976 legacy. They didn't just disappear into the normal world, they infected it. Like a biological event, the 1,000 volunteers of 1976 became a diaspora of radical change. They took the Arcosanti virus, the rejection of sprawl and the embrace of density, and carried it to the cities of the Old World. In the decades following 1976, you could find these alumni everywhere. They became the architects of the first solar-powered communities in Europe. They became the urban planners who fought for walkable streets in Portland and Melbourne. They were the ones who started the first recycling cooperatives and organic farming movements. The 1976 peak was the big bang of sustainable thinking. These people had seen that 1,000 individuals could live without cars and without waste, and they could never go back to the suburban lie. The diaspora ensured that Arcosanti wasn't a dead-end utopia, it was a seed bank. Every time you walk through a high-density, green-roof neighborhood today, you are walking through a dream that was field-tested in the Arizona dust during that legendary summer of '76. Chapter 12, 50 years later, The Ghost in the Machine. Looking back from the mid-2020s, the 1976 surge feels like a message from a parallel universe. Today, we face the same crises that the 1,000 volunteers were trying to solve: climate change, isolation, and the collapse of the industrial grid. But now, we have the technology they only dreamed of. We have high-efficiency solar, AI-driven logistics, and global connectivity. Yet, we lack the one thing they had in abundance in 1976, the collective courage to build something new from scratch. Arcosanti today stands at only 5% completion, and critics often call it a failure. But 1976 proved that the success of an experiment isn't measured by its finished product, but by its data. The peak of '76 provided the data for the future of humanity. It proved that complexity is more valuable than consumption. It showed that we can thrive in close proximity if we have a shared vision. As we look at the concrete apses today, weathered by 50 years of desert sun, they don't look like ruins. They look like a prototype for a Martian colony or a post-carbon city. The 1976 peak remains the high watermark of human audacity, a ghost in the machine of modern architecture, whispering that we could still be more than just consumers. Chapter 13, The Echo in the Canyon, A Call to the Future. We close this journey of Synapse Daily on the edge of the mesa. The sun is setting behind the vaults of 1976. The bronze bells are ringing in the wind, a sound that has not stopped for decades. This sound is a bridge between the 1,000 dreamers of the past and you, listening right now. The 1976 workshop peak was a signal flare. It told us that the future is not something that happens to us, it is something we pour with our own hands. It told us that we don't need $1 billion to change the world, we need 1,000 people with a single, lean purpose. Arcosanti is not a museum, it is a challenge. It asks us, what are you building that will last 50 years? Where is your 1,000-person surge? The desert is still there. The sun is still burning. The silt is waiting for the next mold. The 1976 revolution isn't over, it's just waiting for a new set of hands to pick up the shovel. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the heart of the desert. If the story of the 1,000 volunteers sparked a flame in you, if you felt the weight of the concrete and the hope of the '76 peak, then the legacy continues. Like this video if you learned something new. Comment your thoughts below and subscribe for more fascinating stories of human audacity. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and your hands in the earth. The city of the future is still being cast.